Welcome to IRA, episode 115. It's David Leavitt's world, and we all live in it. I am your host, Goel of Investigations and Ritual Abuse, and I'll be taking you through former Utah County Attorney David Leavitt's abortive political career and his connection to the Hamblin case today. And so the first thing I want to do is bring up a picture. This is who you're looking at here on the left. There's
such a prejudice
in the Native community
in Utah
County on suspicion of ritualistic child sex abuse and his ties to Utah County Attorney David Leavitt,
the Fox
who will
13
not
News
be allowed to
investigative
prosecute
team
this
has
case.
obtained
Fox 13 News investigative reporter
Utah
Adam
County
Hurwitz
Attorney
has
David Leavitt
update.
talking about how he
Well, there are a
adopted
number of reasons why the Utah County
The
Attorney's
video
Office
shows
might
Leavitt
have
explaining
a
how
conflict
he
of
tried to
interest,
broker a
not
deal
just
with a
because
tribe
Leavitt
in
named
Montana,
himself
offering
as
them
a
the
suspect
ability to
earlier this
export
year.
buffalo meat
He's also given
to
multiple
Ukraine
statements
as
about
part
his
of a
relationship
request
with
he
Hamblin
made at the
and
same
some
time
of the
to
alleged
adopt a
victims.
child.
Fox
As you're
13
about
News
to see, the nature of those statements have changed over the past
and the ritual abuse playing in the background. The two videos I was going to pull up. Apologies for that technical malfunction. But at the end of the day, David Leavitt was born on third base and thought he hit a triple. He is, as of 2008 in his congressional campaign, his financial disclosures disclosed a net worth of anywhere between $31 and $81 million. And that was 18 years ago, later this year. So David Leavitt is a man of substantial means. So substantial, in fact, when he torpedoed his political career with a press conference in July 2022, in which he denied being a satanic pedophile and cannibal, a member of an organized ritual abuse ring operating in San Pete, Joab, and Salt Lake and Utah counties over a period of decades. He was able to purchase a castle in Scotland, Knockderry Castle. He and his wife, Shalom, a BYU sexual education professor or sex therapist, Shalom Eastwood Leavitt, departed to Scotland in order to remodel the castle that they had just bought. Now, obviously, the problem here is that no amount of running your own Instagram account on Knockderry Castle's renovations is going to distract from the fact that you were credibly accused by Catherine Hamblin and her sisters, now Kate Baxter. Her sister is Rachel Jones. Her other sister is Eliza Bradford. Those were the three who filled out victim statements in 2012 to 2014 outlining the abuse allegations against David Leavitt, their father David Lee Hamblin, and their mother Roselle Stevenson, as well as roughly 140 other individuals, many of whom are covered and profiled on investigations of ritual abuse. These individuals run the gamut from prominent Latter-day Saint artists to Latter-day Saint businessmen to people like David Leavitt, who are prominent Latter-day Saint politicians or in prominent Latter-day Saint business and political families, such as the Leavitt family. Dixie Leavitt served in the Utah legislature. His son Michael was a two-term Utah governor, also former Secretary of Health and Human Services, and former EPA administrator in the Bush administration. He was tasked with overseeing Mitt Romney's 2008-2012, one or the other, election transition team. Of course, that never came to pass because Mitt Romney sucks at running campaigns. So, ultimately, David Leavitt hails from a very prominent, very wealthy family in the state of Utah. And he and his 6 brothers are all multimillionaires. He and his 5 brothers are all multimillionaires, actually. And most of you wouldn't even know who Leavitt is had he not held his now infamous press conference in which he talked about ritual abuse allegations against him after Catherine Baxter's victim statement from an earlier criminal prosecution and investigation between 2012 and 2014. After that victim statement was provided to him by a member of the press, likely Adam Herbets, the Fox 13 news reporter. In that victim statement, Leavitt is alleged to have raped Kate Baxter and her sisters repeatedly. He's alleged to have received ritual abuse training from David Lee Hamblin, and that ritual abuse training was designed to induce compliance in his children with ritual abuse. David Lee Hamblin purported to be able to teach people how to dissociate their children and create, quote, parts in those children that would enable parents to ensure compliance with abuse by their children. It's an actual training service or class that David Lee Hamblin would come to your house and offer you if you're so inclined to rape your kids ritualistically and non-ritualistically, because a significant amount of the abuse in the Hamblin victim statements has nothing to do with ritual abuse whatsoever. It has to do with just garden variety child rape, if there is such a thing. And in the LDS Church of Satan, which David Leavitt and David Lee Hamblin are alleged to have belonged to, garden variety child rape is a thing. It's distinguished from ritualized child rape. That is ceremonial child rape and ceremonial child abuse. And so David Lee Hamblin was conducting training classes for LDS Church of Satan parents like David Leavitt, Kevin and Khalil Kelly, Brian and Suzanne Krashishnik, and others, in which he demonstrated his techniques for what he purported to be conditioning children to comply with ritual abuse by fracturing their personalities into parts. As you do when you're a charlatan and a pederast in the state of Utah. You use your membership in the Mormon Church to cover for yourself and for your activities behind the scenes with your children and with the children of others within your group. You use that membership as camouflage to mask what you're actually doing, which is, according to Rachel, Eliza, and Catherine Hamblin, worshiping the devil in part by abusing your children. The allegations in the Hamblin victim statements are graphic and grotesque. Quite frankly, it's stomach churning. I mean, it has abuse in there up to and including forcing your children to eat feces and drink urine, as well as every depraved sexual act imaginable committed against children, including a newborn. Because the sisters recount their youngest sister Miriam's abuse beginning after she was brought home from the hospital shortly after her birth. And so David Leavitt, in July 2022, I believe it was, had a press conference in which he announced that there was no organized ring of sexual abuse in those 4 counties that Sheriff Mike Smith of Utah County was allegedly investigating. That is Utah, Salt Lake, Juab, and San Pete counties. The problem was that David Leavitt had previously acknowledged the existence of ritual abuse in an interview that he sat down for with documentarian Amy Hurdy. So we're going to pull that up real quick and let you take a look at what David Leavitt was actually acknowledging, and which has been acknowledged by the church since at least June 1992. The first presidency acknowledged the existence of ritual abuse, discouraged members from participating in it, obviously, in their June 1992 issue of Ensign magazine. So let's take a look at David Leavitt's ritual abuse video. Let's take a look at the video in which he acknowledged the reality of ritual abuse and the fact that he knew a victim of it. That is, the victim in this case would be Catherine Hamblin, a.k.a. Kate Baxter, who currently is suing David Leavitt and others as part of a Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act lawsuit, in which she and her sister Miriam allege abuse that ran through the beginning of their criminal case against their father and others. Well, their father was the one charged in 2012 to 2014. The others, they got off of the hook. They weren't criminally charged or prosecuted. So let's take a look at David Leavitt telling us that he knows ritual abuse is real and that he knows some victims of it.
We are learning more about the man arrested in Utah County on suspicion of ritualistic child sex abuse and his ties to Utah County Attorney David Leavitt, who will not be allowed to prosecute this case.
Fox 13 News investigative reporter Adam Herbets has tonight's update.
Well, there are a number of reasons why the Utah County Attorney's Office might have a conflict of interest. Not just because Leavitt named himself as a suspect earlier this year. He's also given multiple statements about his relationship with Hamblin and some of the alleged victims. As you're about to see, the nature of those statements have changed over the past 2 years.
Would you mind riding in the back of a police car?
Men and women allege David Hamblin used positions of power as a father, a therapist, a neighbor, and as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to ritualistically abuse children. He was arrested Wednesday morning, but investigators say he probably won't be the only one.
I have nothing to hide.
Until Hamblin's arrest, Fox 13 News chose not to identify any of the subjects of the investigation, but that did not stop Utah County Attorney David Leavitt from outing himself as a suspect in June and describing his relationship with Hamblin.
I prosecuted the therapist in Juab County for poaching a deer. He poached a deer to use for ritualistic purposes. This therapist was my elders quorum president in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was my neighbor. I had a family connection.
During that same press conference, Leavitt described his accuser as tragically mentally ill. She's one of the same women who accused Hamblin and others.
Shame on you for doing that. It's uncalled for. He said tragically mentally ill woman 5 times. To attack their mental health status as a way to discredit them, and it was clear that that's what he was doing, and that's just not okay.
There is no organized ring of abuse.
Let's unpack all of that. Someone could be tragically mentally ill and still be telling the truth about their abuse at your hands. In fact, a lot of ritual abuse victims, a lot of sexual abuse victims, a lot of physical abuse victims who were children when their abuse occurred grow up to be mentally ill adults. That's understandable because they were horrifically abused. So he doesn't notice that he doesn't say that Catherine Hamblin, a.k.a. Kate Baxter, is lying about her abuse allegations. He says she's tragically mentally ill. He doesn't say, hey, I didn't do this, like a normal person who's innocent. Instead, he attacks the victim. He employs Darvo, that is the phrase that was coined by the daughter of Peter and Jennifer Freyd, who accused her father of molesting her as a child. Peter and Jennifer Freyd ultimately went on to found the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. There is no such thing as false memory syndrome. It isn't in the DSM. It isn't recognized or validated by the APA. And the studies that have been used to substantiate or support the idea of false or implanted memories have been roundly debunked because they can't be duplicated. And the replication crisis is something that is fundamental within the social sciences, particularly psychology, where something on the order of 96% of studies find a statistically significant result that can only be replicated a third of the time. And in this case, can't be replicated at all because it doesn't exist. There is no such thing as false memories. There are no such things as implanted memories. These things don't exist. They're not scientifically valid. There's no evidence for that. But people who abuse children have routinely cited the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, whose board members appeared in pedophile magazines in the Netherlands in an interview in which they said pedophilia was a responsible choice. That would be Dr. Ralph Wakefield and his wife, or Dr. Ralph Underweger and his wife, Helida Wakefield. So, this is a common feature of the pedophile industrial complex. That is, they ultimately deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. In this case, that's exactly what David Leavitt is doing. He's not directly denying it because he can. It's true. I've spoken to other victims of David Leavitt who tell largely the same story, that he is a sexual sadist and that he traffics and rapes children. I've talked to one person who claimed to be in the room with David Leavitt when he killed a child. And this is not isolated. It's not just Kate Baxter saying this. It's multiple victims saying this. And David Leavitt ultimately had to leave the country in the aftermath of this press conference. He lost his re-election campaign, and he has been professionally occupied with Knockderry Castle ever since. His wife, Shalom, remains a tenured professor at Brigham Young University, and she's alleged to have participated in these rapes and this abuse also. So ultimately, I will say this. I have talked to multiple victims who have identified David Leavitt as their abuser, and multiple victims who have ultimately witnessed David Leavitt engaging in horrific abuse of other children. I've spoken to those, but I have not spoken to victims who identify Shalom Leavitt as part of this. To be fair, other than, say, Kate Baxter, who I've never personally spoken to. I've spoken to many other victims of the Hamlin Group, the so-called Church of Satan, or LDS Church of Satan, which I use to distinguish them from the Levian Church of Satan, because they're Latter-day Saints who apparently are part of a multi-generational group operating within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who participate in organized child abuse. That's the rough strokes of these allegations. That there are a bunch of Latter-day Saints who are covertly Satanist, who believe that their abuse of their children is an offering to Satan that pleases him and enables their advancement in this world. Now, ultimately with David Leavitt, he attacked the victim. He did not outright deny doing what he was accused of doing. He just said Kate Baxter is tragically mentally ill. The reality of it is, okay, do you have any evidence of a psychiatric diagnosis or a mental health diagnosis for Kate Baxter? Because as we're going to see here in a second, Kate Baxter was completely credible to David Leavitt years before. She was credible enough for him to say that he knew victims of ritual abuse. So let's continue the clip.
It was debunked.
But watch and listen. More than 2 years before that press conference, Leavitt sat down for a different interview and was asked if he thought ritualistic sex abuse was real. He went on to describe Hamblin and his own accuser, calling her a victim.
Do I think that occurs? Yeah, I think it occurs. I know some victims of it. Yeah, I know some victims of it. I was not in a position to prosecute it. Who was into Native American stuff, had killed deer and get deer hearts and drink their blood and drink the deer's blood.
At the time, Leavitt was under investigation by Homeland Security. These clips are now evidence in that case. We want to warn you, some of them are very graphic.
How do you train a dog to roll over when it's time to roll over? You know, you do it by giving a reward and repetition. If a man wants to program some little girl to give immoral sex anytime he wants to, you start young and give rewards. You know, I mean, it's unfortunate.
You know, just train him like a dog. Use positive reinforcement. At the end of the day, what this clip shows is that before he became aware that he was accused of being an abuser, he believed Catherine Hamblin to be totally credible. He endorsed ritual abuse as real to a documentarian in this clip. Amy Hurdy sat down for him, interviewed him on the topic of ritual abuse, and he said he knew it was real. He knew some victims of it. That is, Kate Baxter, a.k.a. Catherine Hamblin. And then he got a copy of Kate Hamblin's victim statement from the 2012 to 2014 investigation and prosecution of her father, David Lee Hamblin, and realized that he was named in that victim statement as a ritual abuser, and suddenly Kate Hamblin was tragically mentally ill. That's the level here. It's a complete 180-degree turnaround. On the one hand, he acknowledges that ritual abuse is real, that he knew a victim of it, he knew some victims of it, and he goes on to describe David Lee Hamblin exactly. And by the way, David Leavitt testified in the divorce proceedings of David Lee Hamblin and his ex-wife, Roselle Stevenson, and he testified against David Lee Hamblin in that proceeding, and the court found by clear and convincing evidence that Hamblin had abused the two daughters who testified at that custody hearing. The court found by clear and convincing evidence that David Lee Hamblin had sexually abused Rachel and Eliza Hamblin, his two eldest daughters. Now, Catherine Hamblin and Miriam Hamblin did not testify during those proceedings for obvious reasons. Now, the girls alleged that during the 1999 Church of Satan excommunication of their father, David Lee Hamblin, that they were instructed at that hearing that the divorce would be stage managed, that they would be allowed to talk about certain abuse suffered at the hands of their father, but they would not be allowed to testify about abuse at the hands of others, including their extended family and other adults within their father's group who are alleged to have abused them. They testified that the entire proceeding was stage managed, that the Church of Satan had gatekeepers throughout the state of Utah embedded within the legal and political and business establishment and medical establishment in Utah that could be used to interdict allegations against members of this organization. So when you examine the record in the divorce trial, in the custody hearing, you look at the custody order, the findings of fact, and the conclusions of law. In the 2003 case, the custody hearing against David Lee Hamlin as part of his divorce proceedings, the court found that his daughters were telling the truth about their sexual abuse. They believed them. And as a result, Hamlin was denied custody or unsupervised visitation as he sought with his youngest daughter, Miriam. And by the way, the court also found that Hamlin did any number of things that are contained within the Hamlin victim statements, which were filed with the Provo Police Department later. Key among those things that the court found that Hamlin did was they found that he had administered peyote to all four of his daughters, that he had forced them to ingest peyote as part of Native American religious ceremonies. They found that his daughter, his ex-wife actually, had been present. And they also found that Hamlin had sexually abused two of his daughters. They did not examine whether or not he had abused the youngest two. The youngest two did not testify. They also found that Hamlin had moved in an adult female patient with dissociative identity disorder, that he had moved that patient into his home. That adult female patient is Angela Fenton. And that he had kept his eldest daughter, Rachel, home from school to participate in his, quote, therapy of Angela Fenton, whose main author was a young boy named CJ. Now, in the Hamlin victim statements, the sisters tell of David Lee Hamlin moving one of his patients into his private residence in Provo and forcing his daughters to participate in therapy sessions in which Angela Fenton was sexually abused and also allowed to sexually abuse the Hamlin sisters. All of which is corroborative in terms of the earlier custody hearing and the findings of fact and the conclusions of law that were issued from that hearing. All of which are corroborative of the later victim statements. The court agreed with them. The court found them credible, not tragically mentally ill. So, with David Leavitt, he acknowledges that ritual abuse exists before he denies it. Before he characterizes Kate Hamlin, a.k.a. Kate Baxter, as tragically mentally ill, he describes her as credible. He believes her. And this clip is proof of it. So let's finish it up.
I've never, it's the same way you help a child learn how to make their bed.
Yesterday, after Hamlin's arrest, we asked David Leavitt through his spokesperson for a comment. We were told, no, he does not comment on pending cases. Apparently, that did not stop him in June.
He doesn't comment on pending cases unless he's holding a press conference, and I stand corrected, it was in June, in which he disparages one of the victims is tragically mentally ill after he acknowledged her as credible and her allegations as real. At least when those allegations are directed against other people. Of course, when the allegation is directed against him, suddenly the accuser is tragically mentally ill. But the problem for David Lee Hamblin is Kate Hamblin has two corroborating witnesses, her sisters, who corroborate in detail the allegations against David Leavitt. And so that's roughly what we're dealing with here. And you can see that in that video. How do you teach a child to give you sex? It's like training a dog. Start them young and use positive reinforcement. That's how you condition a little girl to give you oral sex. And you chuckle while you're talking about it to this documentary in an interview because, again, it's David Leavitt's world and we're all just living in it. And, of course, as that clip noted, the interview is now evidence, or was evidence, in a human trafficking case opened by Homeland Security Investigations, and that is related to David Leavitt's illegal adoption of a Native American girl. And that's the next clip I want to pull up for you. So let's pull that clip up and let's review the allegations against David Lee Hamblin as it pertains to Alessandra Fishing Hawk, a little girl that he adopted illegally and carted across state lines illegally, hence the human trafficking allegations against him, or the child trafficking allegations against him. And I'll explain in just a moment why his adoption of Alessandra Fishing Hawk was illegal.
There's such a prejudice in the Native community about a non-Native adopting a Native.
This is not how you adopt a child. This is how you procure a child.
The Fox 13 News investigative team has obtained video of Utah County Attorney David Leavitt talking about how he adopted a Native American child.
The video shows Leavitt explaining how he tried to broker a deal with a tribe in Montana, offering them the ability to export buffalo meat to Ukraine as part of a request he made at the same time to adopt the child.
Fox 13 News investigative reporter.
So there's your first criminal act right there. There's your first criminal act. You cannot exchange anything of value with someone in exchange for an adoption. You can offer, say, the mother of a child necessary support in terms of her prenatal care. You can offer to pay for medical care related to carrying the pregnancy to term, prenatal care, that sort of thing. But you can't offer her anything of value beyond that. You can't offer her payment. And you can't offer the president of a federally recognized tribe anything of value in exchange for that president illegally intervening to give you custody of an enrolled member of a Native American tribe. That's called bribery. And the fact of the matter is, the tribal president in question, Lawrence Chase Kilsback, had no legal authority to overrule his tribal health and human services. He had no legal authority to override federal law, which was on point with the adoption of Native American children. That law is called the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA. And it explicitly stipulates that priority in adoption of Native American children goes to their blood relatives who are of Native descent. Because all these Caucasian couples in the 70s and before were raiding Native American reservations to adopt cute little Indian babies. And they were raising them to be white. And ultimately, Congress passed a law on point governing the adoption and foster placements of Native American children. It's called the Indian Child Welfare Act. And David Leavitt wasn't a blood relative of Alessandra Fishing Hawk. He wasn't a Native American. He wasn't a member of a federally recognized Native American tribe. And so his actions were illegal. They're illegal from the standpoint of constituting bribery, that is, offering to broker a deal to export buffalo to Ukraine with your Ukrainian government contacts, because you're over in Ukraine as part of your nonprofit, allegedly educating their future lawyers and judges as to the American style of law and the American legal system. The fascinating part about David Leavitt's nonprofit is the fact that it operates in countries that are known sex trafficking hubs, like the Ukraine, like Poland, like Moldova, like Romania. And the Leavitt Institute operates in countries that have a sex trafficking problem, a child trafficking problem. And it's just coincidental, I'm sure, that nonprofit operates in those countries and seeks to export American jurisprudence to those countries. So, to recap, David Leavitt offered a bribe to Lawrence J. Skillsback. He publicly acknowledged offering that bribe. We're going to see that here in a second.
Part of a long-standing criminal investigation.
And Tribal Social Services looked at us and said, "We're not giving you this baby."
This video was recorded by a documentarian in 2020. It's 17 minutes long, and it shows Utah County Attorney David Leavitt telling the story of how he managed to adopt a tribal infant in 2017.
And finally, this strategy comes into my head. And if you got 5 minutes, I'll tell you the story.
As he describes it, his strategy meant hopping on a plane to Montana, then walking onto the reservation unscheduled to meet with the president of the Northern Cheyenne tribe.
I said, I'm here for two reasons. I said, I'm here to tell you the second reason first, but I'll tell you the first reason second. And I said, but before I tell you the second reason, I want to tell you a story.
His story touches on the importance of family. Then it highlights his close friendship with former Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko.
Victor and I have this goal of introducing buffalo into Western Ukraine. And you're a sovereign nation, and you have a buffalo herd, and Ukraine is a sovereign nation, and it doesn't have a buffalo herd, but it wants one. And so I'm here to try and see if we can form a bilateral agreement between the people of the Northern Cheyenne and the people of Ukraine to introduce buffalo to Western Ukraine. And at that point, he was all.
Let's unpack that bullshit story. Before he wanted Alessandra Fishing Hawk, David Leavitt made no overtures to either the government of Ukraine or the Northern Cheyenne tribe of Montana to export or facilitate the export of buffalo. But when he realized that Alessandra Fishing Hawk had either been surrendered to Tribal Social Services or had been removed from the custody of her mother, Tona Fishing Hawk, he hopped on a plane to that reservation in northern Montana. He showed up, and he solicited Jace Killsback to intervene because Tribal Social Services, in accordance with federal law, ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, was denying him the ability to take physical custody of Alessandra Fishing Hawk as part of his efforts to adopt her and depart with her from the reservation because federal law bars him from doing so. Federal law gives Alessandra Fishing Hawk's father, Gary Valenzuela, priority. It gives her maternal grandmother and her relatives within the Medicine Top and Fishing Hawk family priority because they are enrolled members of a Native American tribe and therefore given priority under federal law for the adoption of Alessandra Fishing Hawk, their blood relative, not David Leavitt's. That's the reality here. And even if David Leavitt had eventually prevailed to take custody of Alessandra Fishing Hawk, it wouldn't have been a same-day transaction. There's no legal basis for that. But that's exactly what happened. If you believe David Leavitt's story, that he showed up on the Northern Cheyenne Tribe of Montana's reservation, and he offered to export buffalo, or facilitate the export of buffalo, from the Northern Cheyenne Tribe to Ukraine, using his Ukrainian government contacts, you're dumb. You're fucking stupid. Okay? That's an utterly implausible story, and since Jay Skillsback later told an NBC News producer that he received $30,000 in cash from David Leavitt for facilitating this illegally when he had no legal authority to do so, suddenly David Leavitt's story really doesn't hold up. It's implausible on its face. Like, Lawrence J. Skillsback later went to prison for fraud, for the misuse of his tribe's resources. He went to federal prison for that. And ultimately, we already know he's an unethical guy for that. We already know that he's prone to criminal behavior for that. We know he's convicted. He's found guilty, beyond a reasonable doubt, for fraud. He defrauded his own Native American tribe. There's very little reason to believe that he wouldn't break the law with respect to an illegal adoption and trafficking of a Native American child, because he'd rip off his own people for his own personal benefit. And selling a child isn't that far behind it, especially when that child is from a poor single mother named Tona Fishing Hawk, who, by the way, David Leavitt represented before the tribal courts in a criminal proceeding. There is a record of David Leavitt appearing as a licensed attorney within the tribal courts on behalf of Tona Fishing Hawk. And guess what happened magically after Alessandra Fishing Hawk was transferred to the custody of David Leavitt the same day that he arrived on the reservation in violation of federal law? Guess what Tona Fishing Hawk started driving? A gold Cadillac. And when I interviewed a member of her family about this, that member of the family told me that the family had in its possession bank records showing bank transfers to Tona Fishing Hawk from David Leavitt. And guess what happens when Tona is arrested in Oklahoma in late 2022 for domestic violence? Guess who the phone records show that she called? That is David Leavitt. Now, here's a little outline of the pre-existing relationship between Tona Fishing Hawk and David Leavitt. So David Leavitt's wife is Shalom Eastwood Leavitt, and the Eastwood family, through the Native American Placement Program that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints used to operate, placed Mary Medicine Top, Tona's mother, in the Eastwood family, and later placed Tona and her siblings with the Eastwood family. They were never formally adopted. They were never legally adopted or fostered or anything else. There was no legal relationship between David Leavitt and Tona Fishing Hawk, and therefore there was no legal relationship whatsoever between David Leavitt that would have entitled him to take custody of Alessandra Fishing Hawk. And he made multiple trips to the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. He made multiple trips in which he solicited Tona Fishing Hawk to turn over custody of her child to him, and he used financial inducements to do so. And it is egregious that the Utah County Sheriff's Office didn't uncover this and prosecute him, because it is illegal to do this under Utah law. It's illegal to offer any kind of financial inducement for an adoption. In addition, Utah courts don't have jurisdiction over native adoptions. Tribal courts do. So, ultimately, Utah courts had no jurisdiction over the adoption of Alessandra Fishing Hawk. Jace Kilsback had no legal authority to overrule tribal social services. And David Leavitt is admitting here in this clip to offering a financial inducement to a tribal chief to break the law. A tribal president, actually. He is offering an inducement here to Jace Kilsback to illegally procure custody of an enrolled member of a Native American tribe who is a child. At the time, Alessandra Fishing Hawk was an infant. And David Leavitt is on tape here admitting to committing this crime. Now, he's lying about which crime he committed, like what he offered Jace Kilsback. He's lying about the fact that he didn't pay Jace Kilsback, or the fact that he didn't transfer money to Tona Fishing Hawk. He's minimizing what he did. But what he did was a crime. Let's be clear about that. So let's watch the rest of this clip.
Why? The first reason why I'm here is this: that we want to adopt one of your people.
He says Tribal President Jace Kilsback gave his blessing, but Tribal Social Services did not. So Leavitt went back to the president to try again. Watch and listen to how he describes the tribal president made a compelling argument to help Leavitt clear that final hurdle and take home the child that same day.
He said, listen, the Levitts are friends of the tribe. He's an asset. They're assets to the tribe for more than just this. I left, and 5 minutes later, the phone rang, and it was the social worker saying, I think I figured out a way to get this child to you.
Jace Kilsback has declined to comment. At the time of this interview, he was in prison for fraud in an unrelated case.
There is no legal way for Jace Kilsback to transfer Alessandra Fishing Hawk to David Leavitt's custody. There's no legal way for Tribal Social Services to do that. And there's no legal way that jurisdiction was transferred to the Utah courts in this adoption from the tribal courts, which is what would have to happen. There's a whole litany of steps that would have to happen before David Leavitt was allowed to leave the reservation with Alessandra Fishing Hawk in his custody. And so for the better part of a year after he did this, Alessandra's biological father, Gary Valenzuela, who had been paying child support, who had registered with the state of Montana to pay child support, he didn't know where his daughter was. And then he found out that his daughter was living with David Shalom Leavitt as part of an illegal adoption.
Grass, white picket fence house. It's best for the Native children to remain in Native communities.
Stephanie Benally, a Native American specialist for Utah foster care, is not just giving her opinion in this interview. She's describing federal law, the Indian Child Welfare Act, It was passed in 1978 to protect Native American children from being adopted by non-Native families.
Prior to the act, 25 to 35% of Native children were removed from their home and placed in non-Native homes.
There's such a prejudice in the Native community about a non-Native adopting a Native.
Leavitt says the child is family. Technically, she's his step, foster.
You think? You think there's a prejudice against that? Not just in the Native community, but outside of that. Like, at the end of the day, it's called the Cinderella effect. And the greatest predictor that a child will be abused is the presence of a non-biological authority figure within their home. That is, a mother's boyfriend or a step-parent. Adoptive and foster children are statistically exponentially more likely to be abused than biological children. That's the reality. That's why that law exists. That and the fact that Native American children were being robbed of their culture and their identity by being placed with white parents or white adoptive parents who simply wanted a little brown baby. That's the reality of it. It's racial fetishization. And ultimately, in the context of an LDS couple adopting a Native American couple, it's even more troubling because of what the LDS is traditionally taught about people of a darker skin tone, which is their darker skin tone is related to a curse put upon them because of the unrighteousness of the, quote, Lamanites, which are one of two groups within the Book of Mormon, the Lamanites and the Nephites. And so gradually over time, the redemption of the Lamanites was supposed to be manifested in the form of lighter skin. They were to be whitesome and delightsome. That's the culture into which a child like Alessandra Fishing Hawk was being adopted prior to 1978, before the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And that's why that law exists. Because adopting a brown baby is not a form of racial fetish. It's a form of giving them whitesome and delightsome skin by raising them up in a superior moral environment. Ultimately, the reason this should not have happened is because it's a violation of the law, but also because it is not in the best interest of the child when they're bound to be adopted by an LDS couple that believes, and many of them still do believe this, that believes that darker skin is the result of a curse, and that whitesome and delightsome is the standard that indicates moral superiority and moral righteousness. Ultimately, Alessandra Fishing Hawk was turned over into the custody of David Leavitt illegally. She was transported back to Utah, and when HSI found out about this, they opened a human trafficking investigation into David Leavitt.
Great niece gets to decide who's considered family. According to court documents, the child's biological mother willingly gave up her parental rights, but the biological father did not. The court ultimately...
First off, that's a lie. The tribe never decided this through the legal process. The tribal court was not involved. Tribal social services had no jurisdictional or legal authority to turn Alessandra Fishing Hawk over to David Leavitt. Okay? Jace Killsback had no authority to overrule federal law or to make an exception for David Leavitt. And the stipulation in the Indian Child Welfare Act is that blood relatives of the child who are enrolled members of a federally recognized tribe take precedence in terms of adoption or in terms of foster placements. Alessandra Fishing Hawk had a grandmother named Mary Medicine Top who was already in custody, or had already taken custody, of other children of Tona Fishing Hawk, who, by the way, was a drug addict, who had been arrested for child endangerment. At the end of the day, Tona Fishing Hawk sold her kid. Her own family acknowledged that to me. Her own family member acknowledged that she sold her kid to David Leavitt, and that David Leavitt paid for that child. And the facts of this case simply don't align with any legal explanation for how David Leavitt came to be the parent or the custodial guardian of Alessandra Fishing Hawk. Quite simply, this news report minimizes what he did. It's inaccurate, and it's illegal. Jace Kilsback does not have the legal authority to say that David and Shalom Leavitt are the relatives for the purposes of an adoption of Alessandra Fishing Hawk. He does not have the legal authority or the legal place to make that distinction or to represent that falsely to a Utah court. He doesn't. And so the letter that he provided to the Utah courts is irrelevant to this issue, because he doesn't have legal standing or legal authority to make that distinction or to represent that he speaks for the tribe on this issue. He doesn't.
This way, I would like our elected officials to be servants of the public and not self-serving.
Linda F. Smith is a member of the Utah State Bar Ethics Advisory Opinion Committee. She also taught ethics at the University of Utah for more than 30 years. She says the video is concerning in more ways than one.
He was clearly politicking to get his way. It was a little smarmy, a way to talk somebody into letting you adopt a child that might otherwise be better raised by the tribe.
David Leavitt is...
It's not smarmy. It's illegal. It's a bribe. It's a quid pro quo. You illegally allow me to take custody of this Native American child, and I will facilitate the export of buffalo. That's what he publicly admitted to in this video. There's nothing about this that's smarmy. It's outright illegal. It's a crime. It's barred at both the state and federal level to offer an inducement to someone to buy a child, and that's what David Leavitt did. And the Office of Professional Conduct never once reprimanded David Leavitt about this, never once disciplined David Leavitt in any way, shape, fashion, or form about what he admitted to doing in this video, which is a crime. And he is not only an attorney, he's an officer of the court as a county attorney, the chief prosecutor, who's sworn to uphold the law and sworn to abide by the law, both as an attorney and both as a public official. And he didn't do it. David Leavitt repeatedly makes exceptions when it comes to his own desired outcomes with respect to the law. He commits crimes. And that's what he did here. And Gary Valenzuela had no idea where his daughter was for years, searched for her for a year. And David Leavitt was able to use the Utah courts to ride roughshod over Gary Valenzuela's rights as a father and over the rights of Alessandra's biological relatives, Mary Medicine Top, and her sons, the Fishing Hawk brothers. Like, it's that simple. David Leavitt had no legal connection to this child. He had no legal basis to assert custody over this child in an adoption or a foster placement. It's that simple.
Child sex abuse investigation. Last month, he announced he is not a murderer, a cannibal, or an abuser. And he accused the Utah County Sheriff of playing politics right before the primary, even though Leavitt was not publicly named.
This is not a politically motivated investigation.
I mean, is it disturbing? Yeah, it is. You have to kind of separate that and not let emotions affect your investigation at all.
Noel Engels is a former analyst with Homeland Security. He confirmed his team had been investigating sexual allegations against Leavitt for several years. Then in 2020, Homeland Security received the video and started investigating for human trafficking.
It's literally our job, is to make sure children are safe.
5 months after receiving the video, documents show Noel and his team were removed from the case. He has since filed a whistleblower complaint and received back this letter. You allege that Homeland Security improperly terminated an investigation into allegations involving current Utah County Attorney David Leavitt. We emphasize that while the Office of Special Counsel has found a substantial likelihood of wrongdoing, based on the information you submitted in support of your allegations, our referral to the Secretary for Investigation is not a final determination that the allegations are substantiated.
This is not how you adopt a child. This is how you procure a child.
We reached out to David Leavitt for an explanation last week. His spokesperson said he would be happy to tell the entire story, but not until after tomorrow's election, because they believe, quote, this has no bearing on his performance as Utah County Attorney, and
He never told the full story, because the full story implicates him in criminal wrongdoing. On top of that, the fact that there was a substantial likelihood of wrongdoing in the termination of the investigation against David Leavitt by Homeland Security Investigations 5 months after Noel Engels and Adam Kinnaman came into possession of that video that we just saw, where David Leavitt admits to offering a quid pro quo, an inducement, a bribe, whatever, so that he could take custody of Alessandra Fishing Hawk illegally from Tribal Social Services at the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. Despite the fact that there was a substantial likelihood of wrongdoing in the termination of that investigation, nothing happened to David Leavitt, both with respect to the documented criminal behavior in Alessandra Fishing Hawk's adoption and what Leavitt himself acknowledged as credible allegations of ritual abuse against an organized ritual abuse ring operating in 4 Utah counties. That's the reality of it. That's what we're dealing with here. It's David Leavitt's world, and the rest of us just live in it. And so, as it pertains to David Leavitt, we've demonstrated that he violated the law with respect to the adoption of Alessandra Fishing Hawk. We demonstrated that he totally endorsed ritual abuse as a phenomenon before he denied its existence, when he realized that he was accused of being a ritual abuser. That's the reality. That's the reality of David Leavitt. That's the reality of politics in Utah. Is that your last name, your priesthood rank, and everything else insulates you from culpability for criminal acts. Ultimately, what you're looking at here is good old-fashioned Utah sidestepping and semantics. That's what you're looking at right here, right now. And it's not just this allegation with respect to adoption or ritual abuse. It's the fact that in October of 2022, David Leavitt had 4 Venezuelan nationals stowed away in his cabin in Monopole Canyon. He had Franklin Barracoto Guarneri, a man who had previously been convicted in Venezuela of a domestic violence incident in which he tried to coerce the mother of his child into turning over custody of that child illegally. He tried to kidnap his own child, intimidate the mother of that child into allowing him to illegally take custody. He tried to employ threats and coercion to that end. And somehow he winds up in America, in Utah, in 2022, 9 days before Halloween, I believe it was. And in the context of the LDS Church of Satan allegations against David Leavitt, he has 4 people who don't officially exist. He has Franklin Jose Barracoto Guarneri, the Venezuelan national who previously was convicted and had a protection order against him in Venezuela for an incident involving the mother of his child. Jorgelia Axmash, a female Venezuelan national, and 2 unnamed, unidentified minor children. And I know this because I went and got the police report from the Juab County Sheriff's Office, because Juab County Search and Rescue was identified as the law enforcement agency in question. Now, hat tip to a guy named Tom Fairbanks, who was the first to really report on these allegations. Now, he got the location wrong. He got the dates wrong. But he got the substance of it right. David Leavitt had 4 Venezuelan nationals stowed away in his cabin in Monopole Canyon. In a cabin that was off-grid in the middle of a blizzard. So much so that Franklin Guarneri felt compelled to hike out of the canyon, which, by the way, is not easy to do. It's not easy to access the roads in this canyon, let alone get to that property. It takes a good long while to get there. Franklin Guarneri hiked out of there on foot in the middle of a blizzard to get help. And guess who shows up on the scene? David Leavitt. He identifies himself as the owner of the cabin. He admits that he is harboring these 4 Venezuelan nationals in his cabin in the middle of nowhere, Monopole Canyon. He doesn't provide an explanation as to why that's really credible, that would dispel his legal liability, because it is a crime to harbor illegal aliens in the state of Utah. There's an actual statute on point with this. It's a crime at the federal level. Of course, hardly anybody's ever prosecuted. But David Leavitt is allowed to take custody of these 4 Venezuelan nationals. And of course, the address that is given isn't Orem apartment complex. That's where he's supposedly taken them. That's where Franklin Guarneri supposedly resides, according to the police report. Which begs the question, what the hell is he doing in David Leavitt's cabin in Monopole Canyon? What's he doing there? With 3 other Venezuelan nationals, a woman and 2 children. There is no evidence that the Juab County Sheriff's Office ever verified that those 2 children were actually the children of Jorgelia Axmash and Franklin Barracoto Guarneri, or that they were the legal guardians of those children. DCFS was not notified. Child Protective Services was not notified. Those children were not separately interviewed from the 2 adults, Franklin Guarneri and Jorgelia Axmash. They weren't formally interviewed by DCFS or CPS. They weren't even interviewed by the sheriffs. And the sheriffs didn't ask the obvious question, what the hell is David Leavitt doing stowing away illegal immigrants in a cabin that has no running water and no electricity and no central heat in the middle of a blizzard? To the point where Franklin Gwinnett decided to hike out of Monopole Canyon on foot in the middle of a blizzard to get help. Clearly, he didn't have a cell phone to contact David Leavitt or anyone else. Clearly, that wasn't the case. But again, it's David Leavitt's world. We're all just living in it, including those 2 Venezuelan children who I've been unable to locate or ascertain whether or not they're even safe. In the context of the Hamlin allegations, one of the things that stands out about this situation is that Rachel, Eliza, and Catherine Hamlin allege that their group frequently obtained children from polygamous groups and Native American groups precisely because those children didn't officially exist. There was no record of their birth. There's no birth certificate. There's no social security number. There's nothing, which makes them ideal for trafficking. It makes them ideal for being sold to a group such as the one that David Lee Hamlin is alleged to have belonged to, and those children are then sacrificed as part of the LDS Church of Satan's ordinances and rituals taking place in private residences and private property in Sanpete County. That's what's alleged here. And here you have 4 people who were off the grid and off the radar, stowed away in David Leavitt's cabin off-grid in Monopole Canyon days before Halloween, which would be a major holiday for any Satanist group, especially a Satanist group that needs a sacrifice for that holiday. I have, despite over 2 years of searching, been unable to locate Franklin Gwinnett or Rohelia Axmash or those 2 children. The last time that they were seen, the last location, the last anything to do with them, they were released into the custody of an alleged murderer and ritual abuser, David Leavitt. And they have not been heard from since. I've searched court records, I've searched property records, I've searched address registries. I've searched and searched and searched, and they do not exist. I've searched social media. And those 2 children, they're gone. I don't know what happened to them. I hope that they're okay. I hope that they're alive. But again, this is David Leavitt's world, and we all live in it. Imagine if you or I were contacting or were found by the police to have harbored illegal aliens, undocumented immigrants in an off-grid cabin in a remote area, and one of those undocumented immigrants hiked out of that cabin and flagged down a passerby to contact the sheriff's office to come out to our property where we had stowed 2 children who were here illegally with 2 adults who you don't know if those adults are legal guardians or legal custodians of those children. If it were you or I, DCFS would have been contacted, and those children would have been interviewed by a social services worker, and it would have gotten to the bottom of that situation. But because it's David Leavitt, the younger brother of Mike Leavitt, former governor of Utah, those children were not interviewed by a social worker. They were not interviewed by DCFS or CPS. There was no effort made to get to the bottom of whether or not the adults who were with those children actually had legal custody of them, whether or not those adults were even related to those children. Those children and those adults were released in the custody of David Leavitt, an alleged pedophile and rapist. an alleged murderer with a documented propensity for breaking the law. He's on video admitting that he offered an inducement of bribe to a tribal president in order to take custody of another child. And that tribal president later went to prison for fraud, defrauding his own tribe of its resources for his own personal benefit. I mean, that's the level of what we're dealing with here. So, ultimately, that incident with the 4 Venezuelan nationals, 2 of whom were children, is another troubling example of David Leavitt's behavior, which is illegal. It's another example of David Leavitt engaging in suspicious behavior at the very least, and illicit, outright illegal behavior. Now, we don't know what happened to those people. We may never know, thanks to the Juab County Sheriff's Office not doing their jobs, because it's David Leavitt. And if it weren't for Tom Fairbanks reporting on it at all, none of us would have known about it. If it weren't for me chasing it down and getting the correct location and the correct property records and address for that response call and submitting a grammar request, we wouldn't know any of the specifics. Wouldn't have any idea that this ever occurred if it weren't for Noah Ingalls talking to Adam Herbets about the fishing hawk adoption, and Amy Hurdy turning over that tape to Adam Herbets. We would have no idea what David Leavitt did with Alessandra Fishing Hawk in terms of that illegal adoption. We wouldn't even know what occurred. And if it weren't for David Leavitt blowing the whistle on himself at that June 2020 press conference, or June 2022 press conference, we wouldn't know, likely, the ritual abuse allegations against Leavitt. Because Mike Smith is stonewalling the release of those documents as it pertains to a dismissed case for the Sheets case. There's no active investigation allegations that Emily Sheets made against David Lee Hamblin and others, because the case was dismissed. And yet, when I submitted a grammar request for the Utah County Sheriff's Office for the records from the Sheets case, it was denied because it's an active investigation. And it isn't, because it was dismissed with prejudice by Judge Roger Griffin, who also happens to be the judge who was assigned to the divorce papers, or the divorce proceedings, when Shalom Leavitt filed for divorce against David Leavitt. And I believe February of 2024. Now, that divorce petition was withdrawn shortly after it was filed, but it was filed. There is a record of it. Shalom Leavitt was going to divorce her husband, and I guess he prevailed upon her not to divorce him. But Judge Roger Griffin shows up in that case as well. What a coincidence. What a shock. When we're talking about David Leavitt, we're talking about somebody who ultimately outed himself. Nobody was pointing the finger at David Leavitt publicly. And the reason David Leavitt felt the need to get in front of this was because there's a man named Nicholas Alaverdian, who was a Latter-day Saint convert from Rhode Island, who raped multiple women. He used his standing in the church to gain the trust of his victims. He used his membership in the church to gain the trust of those victims. And he was a con man, a grifter, and he was a rapist because he has been convicted of raping a woman. David Leavitt was trying to extradite Nicholas Alaverdian from Scotland, where he had fled after faking his death. And so Nicholas Alaverdian became aware of these allegations because a former employee of David Leavitt's office was his legal representative. And let me pull that up. I want to be sure that I get it right. So, there were 3 Utah County prosecutors who resigned. Craig Johnson was the one in question. Chase Hansen was the other, and Pona Satake were accused of going to a Utah Jazz game with defense attorney Dennis Pawelek with tickets that the defense attorney paid for. They were estimated; those tickets were in the lower bowl and estimated to be worth hundreds of dollars. Pona Satake was investigated for a sexual harassment complaint, alleging that he took photos of women in court and shared them in a group message where the men debated whether or not they were attractive. So Craig Johnson went to Scotland. I verified that. He went to Scotland and he conferred with Nicholas Alaverdian, and according to Craig, by his own words, according to someone that I used to work with, who interviewed him on this topic, or this subject, Craig admitted that he left his laptop open with the Hamlin victim statements, specifically Catherine Hamlin's victim statement, opened up to the page where she named David Leavitt as her abuser. What a coincidence. What an absolute shock. That's what we're dealing with here. Nicholas Alaverdian went and published what he saw in those victim statements on his website. He named David Leavitt as the topic or the subject of ritual abuse allegations. And David Leavitt became aware of this after that victim statement was coincidentally passed to him by a member of the media. So you got Craig Johnson, you got Adam Herbets, and you got Utah County Sheriff's Mike Smith. Those are the 3 components of this. And the 4th component is David Leavitt, who held a press conference exposing that Mike Smith was investigating ritual abuse allegations against him and others. And ultimately, David Leavitt torpedoed his re-election campaign chances, or his re-election chances. He torpedoed his political career and his political future. But he also sabotaged that investigation. And he made sure to characterize Catherine Elena Winters Hamlin, a.k.a. Kate Baxter, as tragically mentally ill when just a year or so before he had sat down for documentarian Amy Hurdy, and in an interview he acknowledged that Kate Baxter was credible. He knew her as a victim, that her father had ritually abused her, only to then turn around and characterize Kate Baxter as tragically mentally ill, because he thought Kate Baxter was sticking with the story in the 2003 custody hearing in divorce proceedings that David Lee Hamlin had sexually abused her. He did not realize that she had come forward with allegations against Hamlin's entire group, including David Leavitt. He talked about ritual abuse and how you condition a girl to give you oral sex. You train her like she's a dog. Start young. Use positive reinforcement. That's how you train a girl to give you oral sex, according to David Leavitt. And like Billy Mays used to say, but wait, there's more. Like, at the end of the day, these aren't the only incidents involving David Leavitt. These aren't the only issues involving David Leavitt. If you're following IRA, you know that I started the series on David Leavitt's former handyman, Dale Bowles, who by my count has over 60 court cases in exchange. That is the online court system here in Utah. And here's the thing about Dale Bowles. His accomplices seem to go to prison, but he does not. He has repeatedly violated his probation in multiple cases, dozens of cases. He has repeatedly been arrested for drugs, for traffic violations such as driving on a suspended license or revoked license, driving without valid registration, driving without insurance. And in some cases, he's been cited within days of his original citation and arrest. And in 2018, he was stopped again, but he was a passenger in the car. And according to news reports, the female passenger in that car was arrested for a drug violation. And Dale Bowles didn't want the sheriff's deputies to impound his car. It was apparently his car that was stopped. He wasn't driving it because guess what? Dale Bowles has had a suspended license for like 2 decades, if his traffic citations are any indicator. So he wasn't driving it. For once, he was in compliance with the law, but his car was about to be impounded because it was part of a traffic stop, and it was also part of a drug arrest. And he didn't have a valid license to be driving it, so he dials David Leavitt up on the phone. Now, how does a 2-bit criminal like Dale Bowles know the incoming Utah County attorney? Because David Leavitt had just been elected. He hadn't taken office yet in Utah County as the Utah County attorney, but he was the incoming county attorney. He had yet to be sworn in. And so Dale Bowles hands the phone to the sheriff's deputy, and David Leavitt says, "I'm asking you not to impound the car." He's asking that deputy to ignore the requirements of the law. And he's doing so as someone that future attorney ultimately will have to refer, that deputy will have to refer criminal cases to eventually. He's doing it as the future chief prosecutor in Utah County. He is improperly using his position as an elected official, as an incoming elected official, to pressure an officer to ignore the requirements of the law and to let a man drive away in that car with a suspended license when that man has had a criminal record spanning 3 pages in the online records, the exchange court records in the state of Utah. That's the subject of our current series on IRA. It's examining the relationship between Dale Bowles and David Leavitt. And part 3 of that series is forthcoming in the next few days. I'm currently wading through records that were provided to me by a source and contacting people who are named as potential sources by that source who could flesh out the full picture of Dale Bowles' relationship with David Leavitt. Officially, according to the news reports, Dale Bowles is somehow David Leavitt's handyman. Now, Dale Bowles has been arrested for burglary and theft and any number of other crimes. He's never done any time. The first documented instance of a connection between Bowles and Leavitt appears because Leavitt was tasked with prosecuting Bowles in Juab County when Leavitt was the Juab County prosecutor. Now, the question of why Leavitt would intervene on behalf of a petty 2-bit criminal, a drug addict, like Dale Bowles, and why he would allow Dale Bowles to do any kind of handyman work for him whatsoever. When David Leavitt, according to his congressional financial disclosures, when he ran for Congress in 2008, he's worth between $31 and $81 million in 2008. And yet he retains Dale Bowles to do handyman work on his properties. That's just bullshit. That's bullshit. He can hire anybody he wants. He can hire a licensed contractor that has far more experience and will do a far better job, and also doesn't have a criminal record and a documented history of substance abuse and addiction like Dale Bowles. If you believe that Dale Bowles was David Lee Hamlin's handyman, I've got some waterfront property in the Everglades to sell you. Contact me. Goel at investigationsonritualabuse.com. I'd love to make that arrangement. No, the story strains credulity, but the allegations against Bowles are simple. He's always been involved in criminal activity. He's always been in the drug game. He has multiple arrests for possession with intent to distribute or for simple possession. He always seems to get pleaded down to a misdemeanor or charged with a misdemeanor when he should be charged with a felony. He seems to get kid gloves treatment by the Utah criminal justice system. This is a guy who has violated his probation multiple times, who has never complied with the terms of his probation across dozens of arrests and citations, who repeatedly violates the law, demonstrates a flagrant disregard for the law, who won't do something as simple as get his license straightened out or maintain car insurance on his vehicle. He won't do that because he's got to spend all of his money on drugs. He's a junkie, and David Leavitt would have you believe that a junkie is his handyman. That's the connection there. David Leavitt was sued for his actions as Utah County Attorney in dismissing the stalking case against a man named Mark Stewart Allen. Now, I have personally interviewed Mark Stewart Allen, and he offers a different alternative explanation for why he was entangled with a woman named Alicia Kohler, who he allegedly stalked. And he violated, allegedly, the stalking injunction. Now, my own personal experience with stalking injunctions in the state of Utah is that if you write about ritual abuse allegations against someone that you've never met, never interacted with, they'll slap you with a stalking injunction. That's happened to me in the 6th Podunk District Court of Manti. I've had, I think, 4 or 5 judges over the course of this case, and they'll put things in a memorandum opinion that are just factually untrue and were never even alleged. Like, I leaked the address of the people that I was writing about, which I did not. I never advertised their current address. I did say where their prior address was because it was relevant to the story. They lived right across the street from David Lee Hamlin. I put David Lee Hamlin's prior address down as well in Spring City to demonstrate that it was corroborative of the allegations against him by his daughters and against that neighbor, a man named Joe Binion, and against Joe's wife, Lee. I've never met Joe or Lee Binion. I've never communicated with him by text or phone or email or anything else. In fact, the sole interaction that I have with him is the comment that I left underneath Joe's restack of a Substack article. It's the only time I've ever communicated with Joe Binion at all. They said that was a violation of the stalking injunction. Well, Joe comes to my Substack and restacks my content, and I left him a little smart-ass comment. Welcome to the game, Joey. Because I ultimately believe he's a coward. I believe that he's 100% guilty of the allegations against him. And he's never sued me for defamation. He's not going to sue me for defamation. He sued the people who paid me for other projects. He sued the people who had me on their podcast, Jason and Alexia Preston of We Are the People, Utah. He sued them for defamation. But he hasn't sued me for defamation, and he hasn't sued Rachel, Eliza, or Catherine Hamblin for defamation. Because if he did, he'd get his ass handed to him. And he knows it. He skipped the depositions in the stalking proceedings. His attorney, who is his son-in-law, Caleb Prue, was allowed to depose a man named Kim Krogh for actions that had nothing to do with me. Ken Krogh went to Joe Binion's pottery shop in Spring City and dusted his feet off on his doorstep and walked away. This is caught on video. And Ken told me that he was inspired by the Holy Spirit or led by the Holy Spirit to do so. In his testimony at the stalking case, he said his bishop had told him that it came from a different source other than the Holy Spirit, and he had to, defer to his bishop. But at the end of the day, Ken Krogh did that. I did not tell him to do that, and he acknowledged that in the deposition. Caleb Prue was allowed to take Ken Krogh's deposition, which later formed the basis of a stalking injunction against Ken Krogh. It had nothing to do with me. I didn't tell Ken Krogh to do it. I, in fact, explicitly told people not to approach or confront anyone involved in the Hamblin victim statements, anyone who's named in the Hamblin victim statements, because I legitimately believe that these people are dangerous. And I believe it's inviting trouble that ordinary people just wouldn't be equipped to handle. I don't approach these people physically. And I'm armed and trained and proficient. And I don't do that. And I want to reiterate to everybody watching, do not approach these people. They are criminals. They are dangerous. And they're criminals and dangerous people who exist in a corrupt state that will ultimately falsely malign you as a stalker for writing about these allegations. That's all I've done with respect to these people. And I got a stalking injunction down in some podunk district court in Sanpete County. Like, they're trying to throw me in jail again for 5 days because I acknowledged that Joe came to my social media profile and liked an article that I had posted. Like, that's the level. They say that that's an indirect communication of Joe Binion. They're probably going to say that this podcast episode is an indirect communication with Joe Binion. I'm worried about that. So I had to pay a $1,000 fine the other time that they wanted to say that that comment underneath Joe's restack of my Substack article was a violation of the stalking injunction. They were seeking $45,000 worth of fines and 61 days in jail for each article that I had written. Now they're seeking 5 days for acknowledging that Joe liked an article that I had reposted on Facebook. I mean, that's the norm in this state. Like, I face more culpability for commenting underneath a restack of my article and for acknowledging a like on my Facebook content than any of these people have faced for raping and murdering and torturing children. That's the level. I mean, we have David Leavitt on video admitting that he offered a bribe and financial inducement or benefit to Jace Killsback, who was later convicted of fraud. We have Leavitt on video acknowledging that, acknowledging the reality of ritual abuse. He knows some victims of it. And David Lee Hamlin's walking around as free as he can be. He has released videos in which he acknowledged having sex with his patients while he's facing a criminal prosecution for having sex with a patient. Having sexual contact with a patient. A man named Tobias Schroeder, who was 5 years old, I believe, when the abuse against him took place. That's the reality of it. David Lee Hamlin is on tape apologizing to his daughter Catherine for raping her. His exact words to her: "I am sorry for raping you. I am sorry for raping you." That's an exact quote. I've got it up on IRA. The entire pretext call. And David Lee Hamlin is convicted in 2014. Charges against him were dropped by the Utah County Attorney's Office. To be fair, that's before David Leavitt assumed office in early 2019, before he took his oath of office and was sworn in as Utah County Attorney. But that's the level that this state operates at. You got a governor who violated the law in his signature collection, whose vendor forged signatures so that he could be eligible for the ballot. And that's your governor. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the alternative was any better. There's a lot of stuff about the alternative that I know that at some point I might decide to publicize once I've further substantiated it. But the allegations against Cox's opponent, Phil Lyman, are myriad as well. Which is why I don't endorse Phil Lyman. And Phil Lyman's involvement in, or presence at, Utah Valley University with respect to the assassination of Charlie Kirk, that's strange credulity. I'm not saying that Phil Lyman was responsible for the death of Charlie Kirk. That's not the case at all. I am saying that it's a hell of a coincidence, like his involvement, his presence, and the facts of both with respect to Charlie Kirk ought to make anybody suspicious. But that's another story for another time in another episode. We're talking about David Leavitt and how this is his world and we all just live in it. At the end of the day, the crimes of David Leavitt are myriad. The bizarre stories about David Leavitt are myriad. I mean, here's a man who's worth between $31 and $81 million. He quits his gig in the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, which a lot of Latter-day Saints try out for every year and don't get. But he abandons that to go be a Delta Airlines baggage handler for $8.50 an hour. That's the official story. And the reason he did it, the reason that he gave for doing that, is because ultimately he wanted to save money on trips he was taking abroad. And save money on airfare, and as a Delta employee, you can get free flights. Man's worth between $31 and $81 million in 2008. That number has only gone up since then. He has enough money to buy a castle in Scotland and to spend millions of dollars renovating it. But he wants to save a few bucks on his Delta flights. That is the biggest crock of shit I have ever heard in my life. other than the stories around his adoption and the fact that he acknowledged ritual abuse and its reality before he discounted it at that press conference in June 2022. In the Hamlin victim statements, David Leavitt is named as the conspirator. That's his role within the LDS Church of Satan. And the conspirator's role is to malign and defame anyone who presents a threat of exposure to the Church of Satan. And guess what David Leavitt did in that press conference? He characterized Catherine Baxter, a.k.a. Catherine Hamlin, as tragically mentally ill when a year or so before he sat down and acknowledged her credibility. He acknowledged the reality of her abuse allegations. It was only when he became aware of the fact that those abuse allegations were directed against him that he suddenly found a credibility issue with Kate Hamlin, because he never thought she would ever speak out against him. He thought she would remain compliant, that she would be afraid of his group. And kudos to Kate Baxter for having the balls to identify her abusers. Kudos to her sisters, Rachel and Eliza, for doing the same. Kudos to those girls for trying to come forward multiple times with multiple law enforcement agencies, everybody from Provo Police Department and Sergeant Dan Dove to Homeland Security Investigations, that is Adam Kinnaman and Noel Ingalls. Those were the two that handled that case and those allegations before the case was dropped, thanks to Steve Andres and others within Homeland Security Investigations. Brandon Crane, who replaced Steve Andres, ultimately had to leave Homeland Security Investigations after it was revealed that a bath salts trafficking ring was operating out of the office under his nose. He didn't know anything about it. 2 HSI employees were trafficking bath salts, of all things, and their boss had no idea what was going on. Again, I mean, that's just it's the way it goes in this state. It is a corrupt state whose leaders are full of shit, and they think you're stupid enough to buy their explanations for it. You know, like Stuart Adams, the Senate president. This is a guy who has the audacity to talk about a sexual relationship between a Utah Supreme Court justice and an attorney in the redistricting fight. He has the audacity to talk about that impropriety when he had Kirk Cullimore pass a law that would allow an 18-year-old to have sex with a 13-year-old and receive a lesser punishment. Because it turns out that Stuart Adams' step-granddaughter, Abigail Marie Ross, I believe her name is, was having sex with a 13-year-old boy. And under Utah's child rape statute, she was 18. She would be prosecuted as an adult, and she would potentially face up to life in prison for what she did. So Stuart Adams felt like that was too severe, obviously, because no one connected to Stuart Adams should face the full measure of culpability like an ordinary person would. So he enlisted Kirk Cullimore to rewrite the law. Now, it couldn't apply retroactively, but it did, as a practical matter, apply retroactively. Guess who represented Abigail Marie Ross? David Lee Hamlin's ex-wife, Roselle Stevenson's attorney, Cara Tangaro, represented Abigail Marie Ross in this case. And she received a lesser sentence because the judge specifically cited the changes to the law. So she didn't go to prison. She didn't have to be registered on the sex offender registry. any other person would face that. But the law was changed so that anyone who's 18 but still in high school, they haven't graduated yet, would be able to receive lesser sentencing under the law. I think it would be a very different outcome if Abigail Marie Ross were the 13-year-old and if the perpetrator was an 18-year-old boy. I think Stuart Adams would have had a very different outlook on how that should be handled. But in the state of Utah, when you're politically connected or you're ecclesiastically connected, such as Gordon Bowen with current quorum of the 12 members and first presidency members, you get a different treatment. You get a different outcome, a more lenient outcome. And as a result, you can do things like keep child porn in your garage. That's what Ogden police officer Colton Johansson, who was a school resource officer, did. And the judge in his case said that he wasn't a threat to the community. Or you could be like a former bishop, Keith Robert Baleo, who sexually assaulted two of his female relatives who had to sit in the courtroom at his sentencing hearing and listen to Judge Thomas Lowe describe their rapist, their sexual abuser, as an extraordinarily good man who did a bad thing. He was a great man, even. That's a level in the state which has a 2.97% conviction rate for rape. So if you're a rapist, you got a over 97% chance of getting away with rape. Even if you don't believe in ritual abuse, that's an egregious statistic. State has an under 13% rate of prosecution for rape reports. And I can show you instance after instance where even if the individual is prosecuted, the prosecution stretches over years and even a decade plus. And it hasn't gone to trial. They brought charges, but they haven't tried the alleged rapist. At the end of the day, Utah has a problem, and that problem is not so secret combinations. It's out there in the open. It's in your face. The corruption is obvious. But nothing is being done about it, and nothing will be done about it until you get out in the streets and raise hell. Utah has an astroturfed Republican Party that isn't Republican at all. It is a state government that determines how the Republican nominee will be selected. And the Republican Party is entitled to govern its own nomination process. The state of Utah has no authority in that area, but it exerted that authority so that the caucus system of the Republican Party would not determine the nominee. There would be an alternative path to the ballot in the primary, and that alternative path would be signature collection, because the so-called Republican establishment in the state of Utah ultimately didn't like the fact that the caucus was going against it. The Republican grassroots were stubbornly persistent in insisting that they select the nominee that represented them as Republicans, as grassroots Republicans, rather than, say, Democratic voters in Salt Lake County being able to vote in the Republican primary for the Republican that suited them. Now, those Democratic voters in Salt Lake County are fully capable of selecting their own Democratic nominee, and they should. They're Democrats. Now, that Democratic nominee in a statewide election is probably not going to win, in all likelihood. So the way that they get a more liberal Republican candidate is by crossing lines in the primary and exerting influence over who the Republican Party nominee is in the general election. And they do that with a great deal of effectiveness, because it's not just David Leavitt's world that we live in. It's everybody like David Leavitt. It's every corrupt politician in Utah. And it's their backers, the people who fund them, who fund their campaigns and help them ascend to high office. It's why your property taxes go up by 25 or 30% year over year. It's why your government doesn't acknowledge your desired policies or outcomes. It's why your church does the same thing. It recently came out that the church intervened when state welfare benefits were going to be suspended for illegals. And they told Utah's legislative leaders in no uncertain terms that the legislation that would remove eligibility for illegal aliens for state benefits was not to move forward, and it did not. Now, that's a violation of the church's nonprofit status. They're barred from participating in political activity. They routinely disregarded that, and they kept their tax exemption. Christ says to render unto Caesar what is due to Caesar, render unto God what is due to God. The reality of it is there's no tax exempt status in the New Testament for churches. There's no basis for that whatsoever. Now, I'm not a man who supports imposing taxes on anyone. I don't think anybody should pay a federal income tax. I really object to a state income tax, any kind of direct tax on income. That's my personal belief system. So it's not like I'm arguing with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints should have to pay taxes. But if everybody else does, they should. And so should every other ecclesiastical institution. And here's the thing, if they did, there wouldn't be a state income tax in the state of Utah. There wouldn't be a federal income tax if churches were sacked with that kind of liability, because they would organize against it, and they would organize their congregants against it. It's a way of sitting them on the sidelines when it comes to unjust taxes on income. Regressive taxes on income, and it is regressive. A lot of people complain that 47% or so of the American people don't pay a federal income tax, and one of those was Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney didn't have the same attitude of paying taxes as a form of personal responsibility or an indication of personal responsibility when it came to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He didn't have that attitude at all towards that church. But he did have it towards the 47% of Americans who don't pay a federal income tax. And what I'm saying is that number should be 100%. Nobody should pay a federal income tax. We should all be the same in that respect. But we're not. Some of us, like David Leavitt, can get away with all sorts of illegality and criminality. Some of us, like Spencer Cox, can violate the laws around signature collection. Some of us, like Stuart Adams, can use his connections to people like Kurt Cullimore and others to change the law to benefit his step-granddaughter, Abigail Marie Ross. Some of us can corrupt government and public service for our own benefit. And as Utah evolves and things become more and more dire and more unaffordable for ordinary people as counties routinely raise property taxes against the wishes of their voters and their constituents. What we see are the secret codes and combinations coming out to the open. We see the corruption. And here's the thing. David Leavitt thinks there's not a damn thing you're going to do about it. He thinks that nothing is ever going to change. And the same thing with Spencer Cox. It's not just ritual abuse. It's not just sexual abuse. It's corruption in all of its forms. And that corruption is eating into your bottom line. If you're tolerant of sexual abuse of children, it doesn't outrage you enough to become active. It doesn't outrage you enough to become radicalized and mobilized politically to do something more than 2.97% conviction rate for rape. And guess what? You're probably not going to do anything really about property taxes. You're not going to do anything about the income tax side. You might bitch about it, but you're not going to do anything effective. And your judges, they're always going to win their retention elections because you're not paying attention to judges who call rapists extraordinarily good men, or people who possess child sexual abuse material as they're too privileged to go to prison for having child sexual abuse material. That's what Judge John Torgerson did. That's what the judge in Colton Johansson's case did. She said that he wasn't a threat to the community, even though he admitted to raping an infant in 1994 and to having child sexual abuse material in his garage in violation of the law as a school resource officer who worked with children. And she's going to be retained. Every other judge that I've mentioned will be retained. Judge Roger Griffin has no fear of losing his retention election because none of you are going to do anything about it. You might bitch, you might complain, but you're not interested in an effective mobilization to confront this and deal with it. It's not your problem. It's not your kid. It's not anyone you know. And the church is true, and as long as your exaltation is assured by your compliance with this and by turning a blind eye to this, you're fine with it. It's David Leavitt's world, and it's only David Leavitt's world because you concede it to him. And you concede it to others like him. If you don't like your reality, then change it. This is Goel of Investigations of Ritual Abuse, concluding Livestream 115. Thanks for watching. Thanks for sharing, and thanks for supporting us. If you can subscribe or donate to the cause at IRA, or if you would like to organize effectively or mobilize against this, please do. Please do. It's not just ritual abuse we're fighting here. It's corruption in all of its forms. It's just not so secret codes and combinations that define the Gadiant and robbers in the state of Utah who have overrun virtually every aspect of our political and legal institutions and our culture. This is Goel of Investigations of Ritual Abuse signing off for episode 115 on Monday.